My name's Steve Barr, or Stephen Matthew Barr, and I am a Professor Emeritus at the University of Delaware, a Professor of Theoretical Physics. I guess you can call me Professor is my title.
Professor, tell us a bit about yourself and your career in science.
Yes, so my career in science is fairly easy to tell about. So I majored in physics in college. I went to Columbia University, and then I went to grad school at Princeton, got my PhD in 1978, and my field of study is theoretical particle physics. And so I've been actually mostly doing research for the time since 1978, but also some graduate teaching, very little undergraduate teaching. And I could tell you about what I do research on, if that's interesting to people.
Yes.
So the field of particle physics, also called high-energy physics, is the branch of physics that is trying to find out what are the fundamental constituents of matter, what are the fundamental forces of nature by which they interact with each other, and what are the fundamental laws that govern all of that. And so my particular areas of interest that I've written a lot of papers on are so-called grand unified theories. Those are theories that they give a unified mathematical account of the three non-gravitational forces of nature that we know. In the olden days, they would call unified field theories. No one calls them that, the grand unified theories. I also work on the cosmology of the early universe, things like dark matter, dark energy. Why is there more matter in the universe than antimatter? That's a result of things that happened soon after the Big Bang. So I do things having to do with the history of the universe shortly after the Big Bang. And some more technical things that probably wouldn't mean much to your audience, but things having to do, well, one topic of great interest to me is why the different fundamental particles have the masses that they do. That's a big unsolved problem, which I've done a lot of work. And neutrinos, I've done work on neutrinos and things like that. So
in terms of just from reading your biography, what are the two theorem or observations that bear your name?
Well, it just happens by a kind of fluke that there are two things that sort of are partially named after me. They're still of a hypothetical and theoretical sort. That is, they haven't been confirmed to be the truth about nature. One is called the Nelson-Barr mechanism, and there's a big, one of the big unsolved problems or unanswered questions in particle physics is why neutrons don't have a certain property that theoretically you would expect them to have. And in particular, they should have a certain kind of distribution of electric charge on them, called an electric dipole moment, that they're not observed to have. And that's a big puzzle. And so there are several theoretical theories to explain that. And one of them is called the Nelson-Barr mechanism, and it was an idea that really came from a woman named Ann Nelson, a physicist named Ann Nelson, and I wrote a paper really on the heels of her paper, and it's been named after both of us. It hasn't been confirmed to be the correct explanation. We still don't know which of the competing explanations is the right one. Another thing that actually has my name attached to it is a particular, it's called a Feynman diagram, or it's a quantum process that actually contributes in certain kinds of theories to this particular property of particles. So if neutrons do have this property, or if electrons have this property, or other fundamental particles, it may be due to this process that's called the Barr-Z diagram. It's for those who are physics fans. It's a particular Feynman diagram. It's called the Barr-Z diagram. So those, so again, we don't know if this process happens in the real world. Very likely, it does, but we don't know. So I can't claim to have made any discoveries yet.
As regards the purpose of your visit to Michigan and the lecture you'll be giving this evening on the relationship between faith and science, just tell us, what is the relationship between faith and science?
Well, our main goal is to show people there's no contradiction. And as you know, since, well, at least for 200 years, there has been a school of thought that says that to believe in God or to believe in traditional religion is inconsistent with what science has told us about the world. It's sometimes what's called scientific atheism, scientific materialism. I guess if you ask me what is the relation, I would put it this way. What science is trying to do is find out how nature works. Nature has a certain orderliness, an order, and in particular, it's a lawful order. There are laws of nature. And people in science are trying to understand the orderliness, the order of nature and its laws, trying to find out what those laws are. But where do those laws come from? Well, those laws, for those of us who believe in God, those laws are God's laws. That is, the laws point to a lawgiver. And so God is the author of nature. This is a traditional Christian idea. Many early Christian writers say God is the author of nature. So, and many of the early Christian writers say that God wrote two books, the book of the scriptures, but he also wrote the book of the universe, or the book of nature. So the scientist is trying to read the book of nature and understand the rules of grammar, so to speak, in which it's written. But God is the author of the book of nature. So that's really the relationship between the two. So we don't see science and faith as being at odds at all. We actually, the more nature points to its author. The laws of nature point to the lawgiver. As St. Paul said, we know that God exists through the things he has made, which means the things that scientists study. So we see that they're harmony. But there are many of our contemporaries who see quite the opposite way. And they think that science explains everything. So if science explains everything, then what do you need religion for? If science explains everything, then there's nothing for God to explain or for religion to explain. And that is a very misguided and superficial view of things, in our opinion.
So historically speaking, as an overview, what has been the relationship between Christianity and in particular Catholicism and science over the past 2,000 years?
Yes. So modern science, what we consider science as it's done today, really had its origin in the scientific revolution. Well, it built on ancient foundations laid by the ancient Greeks and Babylonians and others. But modern science really took off with the scientific revolution, which happened started a little over 400 years ago. The Catholic Church, as many people do not realize, has played an enormously positive role in the history, in the beginnings of, and in the development of science. It's kind of sad that when I've asked audiences over the years, and I speak to Catholic audiences, I would ask them what historical name comes to mind when you think of the relation of the Catholic Church to science. And they all say Galileo. That's the only name that comes to their mind. That they all say it immediately, Galileo. And the Galileo affair was a tragic episode. But it was really the exception to the rule. It was a bump in an otherwise, it was one dark spot in an otherwise very glorious history. What people do not appreciate is that from the time of Copernicus, who was an official of the Catholic Church, and Galileo, who was a practicing Catholic all his life, from the time of those early foundations of modern science, at least until the middle of the 19th century, almost all of the important and great scientists were Christian believers, most of them quite devout. That's true of Isaac Newton, for example. It was true of the greatest physicists of the 19th century, generally considered to be James Clerk Maxwell, a Scottish gentleman, and Michael Faraday, deeply devout Protestants. Scientists were very religious for most of the history of science. And in fact, our very notion of laws of physics has Christian roots. From ancient times, the Christian writers, the early church fathers, said that one of the main evidences of a creator was the order of the universe, the existence of the universe and its orderliness and lawfulness. And then in the 1600s, two people, Descartes, a Catholic, and Newton, a Protestant, had the idea that there were mathematical laws of nature, and that they saw them as God's laws. They were mathematical laws that God had imposed on the material world. That's how they saw it. And it's from them that the whole idea of mathematical laws of physics comes. So, when our atheist friends say, we can explain everything through the laws of physics, what you should say to your atheist friends is, yes, but why are there laws of physics? Why are there laws at all? That idea comes from Christianity ultimately, and we have an answer to that because there's a lawgiver. I have never heard an atheist give any kind of coherent answer to the question of why there are laws. But anyway, to get back to your question, so not only were most of scientists until sometime in the 19th century themselves devout Christians, but a little-known fact, though it's becoming increasingly known, is that there have been quite a few important scientists, ones who, in fact, founders of whole branches of science, who were Catholic priests. So if you ask the audience who Galileo is, they've heard of him. If you ask them, show them a picture of Georges Lemaitre and say, who is that? They don't know. Well, Georges Lemaitre was a Belgian theoretical physicist and mathematician who also happened to be a Catholic priest, who is the person who proposed the Big Bang Theory, and which is our fundamental theory of the beginning and development of the universe as a whole. One of the pillars of modern physics is the Big Bang Theory, and that was proposed by the father of the Big Bang Theory, you might say, was a Catholic priest physicist. And now everyone's heard of Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk who founded the science of genetics. But one of the founders of astrophysics, one of the first astrophysicists really, was a Jesuit priest named Father Angelo Secchi. One of the founders of the science of acoustics were two people, Galileo and a French priest named Marin Mersenne. Geology, one of the founders, you might say the first geologist in a way, one of the founders of the science of geology was a Danish person named Niels Stensen, who eventually became a bishop and is now blessed. Nicholas Steno, that's his Latinized version of his name. And so there's a long roster of, we're not just saying scientists, but major scientists, founders of fields of science, who are Catholic priests, and this needs to be better known. And if people were aware of this history, I think a lot of the problem would be overcome. A lot of the misperceptions would be overcome.
Why do you think these things are not better known?
Because we haven't told our story. See, the fault lies with us, unfortunately, and as Catholics, we're used to confessing our faults. So, I think it's partly because we haven't been telling our own story. We've hid our light under a bushel basket, I think, and it's largely because most people aren't aware of this, so they can't tell the story that they don't know themselves. But now, I think this information is beginning to percolate out. But we have a lot more work to do. This idea that scientists, there's this myth. It's actually the historians of science call it the warfare myth or the conflict thesis. And the thesis, it was a myth that really developed in the 19th century through the work of some fairly incompetent amateur historians, as it turns out, that there was this historical conflict between science and religion, especially in the Christian world. And that story, or now we'd say narrative, kind of took off and is widely believed. It really, everybody unthinkingly and accepted this, even many historians of science. That became the standard tale. But now people have started to pay closer attention to the actual history of science and see that it's not just wrong, it's the upside down, it's a complete reverse of the truth. That all of these great, and it's partly, I think, due to the Galileo story, which is such a dramatic tale. I mean, there you had really the founder of modern science, Galileo, who deserves to be called that, and the Catholic Church as the protagonists on something everyone can understand. Does the earth go around the sun or the sun go around the earth? It's such an easily understood story, and the church authorities got it wrong. And so I think that very dramatic story has sort of colored everyone's perceptions, and that's often, as I said, the only thing they know about the history of the relations of church and science. But it turns out that dramatic story is not typical. That's not typifying anything. That was really an aberration, and the bigger story is that the church. I'll give you a quote from an eminent historian of science named Lawrence Principe, who's a professor of the history of science at Johns Hopkins University, and he said in one of his articles that the Catholic Church has probably been the largest and longest-term patron of science in history. We have actually a glorious history, the Church, in regard to science, notwithstanding that one very tragic episode. On the whole, except for that, the Church's role in science has been enormously positive. Anyway, but I could ramble on for hours about that. But
to what degree do you think that common misconception, as you suggest, between faith and science is a stumbling block or a barrier for the modern person, and particularly perhaps maybe young people in coming to know Christ and His Church?
It's a huge, and this is not just a surmise on my part. There actually have been surveys done, one by the Pew Research Group and one by CARA, which is a Catholic survey organization, that have shown that I think the number one reason given by young Catholics who abandon the faith is that they believe that there's a conflict between science and religion. That may not be the real reason, it may not be, but it is at least one, it is probably the most often given answer. So it's a huge problem. It's an enormous pastoral problem, which I think the Church is beginning to wake up to. And in my experience is that the bishops found out about the Society of Catholic Scientists and are very supportive of it, and I think there are more initiatives, actually spontaneously, I think providentially, springing up independently of each other to try to address this problem. And the Society of Catholic Scientists, which I and some friends founded, is one of those initiatives, but there are a number of others, thank goodness.
Tell us about the foundation of the society. How did it come about?
Well, I, for many years, had thought about that there ought to be an organization of Catholic scientists. And for two reasons. One, I think when you're young and in science, if you're a student, you might feel isolated. You don't face hostility. This is not what you normally face as a religious person in science. But what you often face is a sense of isolation, because many scientists or science students who are religious tend to be quiet about it. It's a vicious circle. They tend to be quiet, and as a consequence of them keeping it to themselves, other religious scientists don't know that there are others. They think they're the only ones. They might be surrounded by scientists who are religious, but they don't necessarily, they're not aware of it. And so this sense of isolation, I think, is bad. It's psychologically harmful. And the second thing is that I thought it would be good to have, so one idea was that an organization of Catholic scientists would be a place where Catholics and science could have fellowship with each other and not feel isolated and become aware that there's actually a large number of us. But the other thing is I thought it would be good to be a witness to the world of the harmony of faith and science. The point is, you can always find, if you find a religious scientist and he goes out there and says, see, science, and first of all, if a theologian says, science and faith are not in conflict, people will not be impressed. They'll say, of course, he's a theologian. What else is he going to say? right? Even if you found a scientist saying there's no conflict between faith and science, they'll say, well, he could be an oddball, he could be an outlier. You can always find one scientist who'll say anything. But if you have an organization of a large number of accomplished scientists who are all saying that they were believing and practicing Catholics, that tells you something. And that was sort of one of the ideas that was in my mind. And so, but I toyed with this idea for many years, but never thought I'd get around to doing anything about it. And then I heard from another scientist much more eminent than I am, who was a convert to the faith, and he suggested that we join forces and do something about it. That was in 2016. So we actually incorporated in the summer of 2016 with 6 members, which some friends of ours, and now we're up to 2,000 members. And to be a regular member, and that's about 2/3 of our members, to be a regular member, you have to have a doctorate in a natural science, and the remaining members are mostly student members. And we also have a class of membership for people with master's degrees in science. So we've grown in a gratifying pace, I would say.
So do you feel as an organization or part of a movement to display the harmony between faith and science, do you feel that you're on the front foot or fighting a rearguard action? As in, are you optimistic that things are going in the right direction?
Well, as Chesterton said, it's not a question of optimism or pessimism. A Christian isn't called to be optimistic, he's called to have hope, which is a different sort of thing. I don't know. I'm very actually think there are a lot of grounds for hope and even optimism. First of all, I think the facts and arguments are on our side. A lot of the arguments of the atheist scientists, and we've heard a lot from the atheist scientists, the so-called new atheists, and they have been very vocal. But in fact, their arguments are often based on historical falsehoods, or slanted or twisted or slanted interpretations of the discoveries of science actually imply, or just bad philosophy. The historical facts and the actual content of scientific discoveries, if you look at them without atheist prejudices, are really in our favor. So the facts and arguments are in our favor. That's the good news. That's the important. The challenge is to get these facts and arguments out, knowledge of them spread among the public. It's to get people to know the facts and arguments, to become aware of them. And that is a big challenge. We're trying to, there's this myth that's been out there now for almost 2 centuries. And overcoming this myth is going to take a lot of work. We have to work at it. It's not going to happen by itself. And so people have to take the problem seriously, and they have to be active about it. And so parents should not wait to find out that their child goes to college and becomes an atheist. You have to, Catholic high schools, Catholic parents have to be aware of these issues and have to do something about it. And the good news is there's a lot of good material out there that they can rely on. They don't have to themselves be scientists or philosophers or theologians. There are books. There's a very excellent textbook meant for Catholic high school students on this subject. I recommend it very highly, written by a good friend of mine named Chris Baglow. But there's a lot of good educational material on the website of the Society of Catholic Scientists that I think would be enormously helpful to parents and high school teachers and so on, or college students, or highly educated, or even the average Joe on the street. And it's there. People have to educate themselves about these issues. So if people will take it seriously and do something about it, I'm extremely optimistic. But if they bury their heads in the sand, then I wouldn't be optimistic.
Last question, I think. The Church, obviously, throughout her history, has, especially through sort of significant minds like Augustine or Aquinas, has been good at synthesizing scientific learning with Christian orthodoxy, whether that be the science of Plato or the science of Aristotle. Mm-hmm. have we done enough, or is there more to do in terms of showing the compatibility of modern scientific learning with Christian orthodoxy? Essentially, like I guess a new synthesis.
Well, there's more to do. I can't. Actually, it's interesting that St. John Paul II, in one of his addresses back in the 1980s, I think it was, he said, we have to admire the work that that the medieval scholastics did in synthesizing the science of their day, which was Aristotelianism, with the faith and showing the harmony. He said that we face a similar challenge today with modern science, and he said we should ask ourselves, have we done as good a job? And he's talking about theologians, or generally Catholic scholars. Have we done as good a job as they did back then? And I think the implied answer is no. So we have our work cut out for us. I made my own little contribution in this regard through a book I wrote back in 2003 called Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, where I, as the title implies, I was mostly dealing with questions connected with physics, but I was trying to show a harmony, how what we know from modern physics and what we understand through our faith actually dovetail with each other in many respects. And I mentioned it earlier, but there's a book that covers a broader range of science-faith questions, including evolution and human origins and other things, by Christopher D. Baglow. It's called Science, Faith, and Theology, I think, or Science, Faith, and Reason, I think it's called. Second edition. It's a very good book. So there are books. There's a lot more being done on that now than in the past, and so it's not a completed project, but there's a lot of good material. I may say that my book is good, if I'm allowed to say that, but there's a lot more material. I remember when I was a graduate student, there was almost nothing out there to read. I mean, if you wanted to read about the relation of science and Catholic belief, there's almost nothing. It's like a desert, as far as books that I think would be helpful to our contemporaries. So I think things have much improved, and hopefully they'll continue to improve.
And if there's a Catholic scientist watching this, interested in your work and the society, what should they do?
Well, if they're interested in the society, they should go and go to our website, and they can find it. If they don't have a good memory, they just Google Catholic and Scientists, and you'll find it. It's called the Society of Catholic Scientists. The actual link is Catholic Scientists, all one word, plural, CatholicScientists.org. And there's a place where you can go and join and fill out a very short little form, application form. If you're a believing and practicing Catholic and you have a doctorate in a natural science, and you have to read our definition of that because it's not what you might think. We include mathematics, for example, as a natural science. You're very likely qualified and will be accepted as a member. But you can look over all the materials on our website to see if we're your cup of tea. We have about 50 videos from we have an annual conference and about 50 videos of talks from our conferences. There's 31 articles on various aspects of the topic. We have all sorts of educational and material that I think people will find helpful, and if they find this to be interesting to them and they want to join it, the dues are very low. The dues are minimal, so but the dues are important because it's what keeps us going. So please join. Please join if you're a Catholic scientist. But even if you're not a Catholic scientist, please go to our website because we have a lot of good stuff there for you. There's other groups. I could mention other groups that are out there. The Thomistic Institute does good things on science, and among other things, there's various other Catholic institutes. Bishop Barron is beginning to pay more attention to science, faith questions. Father Spitzer has an organization. So I said there's a lot of initiatives out there. But if you are a Catholic scientist in particular, then we're the group for you.
Professor Barr, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.